So what are global value chains? I'm sure you'll hear this term all the time these days. It may sound very boring and technocratic. Think of it as being the new face of international trade. So at the World Bank, every year we prepare one report, one flagship report that's called the World Development Report. We choose one issue and we cover this issue in great depth. A year and a half ago, we decided to write about international trade, and global value chains are the new face of international trade. So you can take this as our thinking on the role that international trade plays these days in development. When we started working on this topic, we approached it from the beginning from the point of view of developing countries. So our interest, international trade has been important for all countries, but especially for the smaller countries. And by smaller here, I mean in terms of economic size. We live at a time when things are changing very fast. There are new technologies in the horizon. There is automation, there is machine learning. There is also a rise in protectionism, especially in the US, but I would say more generally in advanced countries. And against this background, the question we wanted to ask, we in the World Bank, would we be still comfortable saying to developing countries, saying to countries like Kenya, you should do everything you can to embrace international trade and be more open and more connected to the rest of the world? So is that a message that's still relevant today in this new world that we live, or has this message become outdated? So this was our thinking. And as I said, we approached this question from the beginning from the point of view of developing countries. So the answer very briefly is, as I'm going to show you in a moment, there is a lot of evidence that global value chains based on historical experience have boosted incomes. They have created better jobs. They have reduced poverty in many developing countries, especially in East Asia. So they have done many good things. Not everything is rosy, so they've had mixed impact on the environment, they've had mixed impact on inequality. In many cases, we show that they actually led to an increase in inequality. However, our view at the end is that they can continue to support development if developing countries do their part, which is undertake deep reforms, not just superficial reforms. And on the other hand, industrial countries, so countries like the United States, countries in the European Union, pursue open and predictable policies. So, and the latter is very important these days. So, with this very short introduction, let me get to the substance of the talk and start by defining what global value chains are. So what exactly are global value chains? So, in the old days, when people thought about international trade, they thought about one country producing a product, let's say a car, and then exporting it to another country. So this was direct trade from one country to another. What happens in global value chains is you take a product, let's say a car, you break it into parts and components, and then you trade parts and components back and forth between countries. So in that sense, you have, even if you trade one product like a car, you end up with much more trade because you trade parts and components. This doesn't apply only to cars. So almost every product and every service can be traded this way these days. So, and accordingly, to use some terminology, in some cases, we talk about forward participation. So there are some countries, and many developing countries fall into this category. They produce raw materials or agricultural products, cotton, for example. They produce it, then they export it to another country. Then this recipient country takes this product, let's say it takes cotton, it processes it, produces something else, cloth. Then it takes this cloth and it exports it to a different country. Okay, so it's not a final product that goes directly to the consumer, it's an intermediate product that goes to another firm. So this firm exports it, or this country exports it to another country, and this other country, this final recipient, processes it further. It may produce textiles or clothing, and sells it to the final consumers. In some cases, it may export it back to the original country. Okay, so in that case, you start with cotton, cotton becomes cloth, cloth becomes a different type of cloth, and these products get traded back and forth. Same thing with cars. That's the classic example that people always give when it comes to global value chains. So you start with steel or rubber, you export these raw materials, then they get processed, you produce some parts, some intermediate parts, maybe engines, maybe brakes, then you may export them to another country, assemble them there, and eventually you produce the final product, the car, and you export it to another country. Okay, so this is the nature of global value chain. So value chain in general means it includes all steps that the business takes to produce a product or service and bring it to the consumer. And we use the word global to make clear that in this age of globalization that we live, these value chains cross borders. So these firms that trade products and parts and components back and forth are located in many different countries. Okay? So now, why is this important? Why do we think global value chains are important for international trade? So there are two features that make them very special in international trade, and both are important for developing countries. So the first one is that you have a lot of fragmentation. So take again the example that I gave you for a car, you trade parts and components back and forth. And what this means for a developing country is that in principle, it may make it easier for a country to participate in trade. Take the example of Mexico. So Mexico is a country that has participated very successfully in the production in the automobile industry. For a country like Mexico, it might have been very difficult to produce a car, the final product we call a car. Why? Because once upon a time, it didn't have the capabilities to do that. It didn't have the technical know-how, it didn't have the capital, it didn't have the machinery, it didn't have the skilled labor that was needed to produce a car. But it was much easier for Mexico to participate by producing parts and components that didn't require the full range of capabilities. So from that point of view, it makes it easier for a developing country to participate in trade. So that's the first reason. There is a second reason, which actually is even more important for developing countries, and this is that what happens in global value chains, in value chains in general, they are, as we say, relational in nature. So they don't happen in anonymous markets where firms trade back and forth without knowing anything about each other. So with global value chains, you have relationships between firms, relationships that persist over long periods of time. And what this means is it allows firms to engage much more successfully in knowledge transfer, in technology transfer. And because of that, it allows firms to also raise their productivity much more than it might have been the case with traditional trade. If you read the report, I don't have time to go over it in detail, but we cover, one example we cover is the flour industry in Kenya, which is a successful example, a successful case of global value chain participation for Kenya. And this is a case where trade is very much based on relationships. Very briefly, as I told you, I don't have the time to cover this, but one advantage of these relationships in the context of Kenya is we often hear from many that one problem with developing countries in many cases is you don't have stability. You have policies are not predictable. You have things changing very, very fast. In the worst case, you may have violence, you may have conflict, and this stands in the way of trade and growth. Well, in such an environment, it might be very hard to write contracts that you can enforce. Relationships help alleviate this problem. So relationships in many cases may be a substitute for good institutions. Not that good institutions are not important and we should always push for good institutions, but in cases where you don't have them and you don't know where to start, these relationships may help. So for all these reasons, these relationships, these global value chains that are based on relationships can actually foster development. So this is what makes them special. So starting with this, with this thinking, the questions we asked in this report, we started with outcomes. And what we looked at was the question of whether global value chains are associated with better outcomes. Because if the outcomes are not good, there is no point of pushing for them. So the first question we asked was, do we have evidence that global value chains contributed to development? And the answer is no. My background is an academic one. I'm an academic economist. I was an academic economist before joining the World Bank, so in academia we tend to be very nuanced. Everything has pros and cons. And we're very hesitant to say with confidence, this is good and this is bad. But when it comes to the effects of global value chains on growth and development, the answer is that they unambiguously have very big effects on growth and development for developing countries. And I'll show you why. I'll show you why in a moment. Before I get there, I want to make one more point. And this is, many people ask, which are the countries that participate the most in global value chains? And why is it that some countries participate and some others not? One point we actually emphasize in our work is that if you look at the maps, if you look at the data, it turns out that all countries in the world participate, but they participate in different ways and they participate to a different extent. So the question is not simply whether or not you participate. So Kenya participates, Ethiopia participates, almost every country in the world participates, but the question is how you participate. And how large is your participation? So let me show you, in a map and using colors, what the map of participation is. So in shades of orange, you can see countries that participate through trade in commodities or raw materials. So these are countries that, for the most part, export materials to other countries. And when the colors get darker, it means they participate more intensely. So many developing countries tend to participate in trade by exporting raw materials and commodities. Many of these countries are in Africa, many of these countries are in Latin America. Then in shades of blue, you see the countries that participate in manufacturing. Again, light blue means low participation, darker blue is more participation. Actually here the dark blue denotes advanced manufacturing. So light blue is limited manufacturing. Limited manufacturing means you produce products like textiles, footwear, agribusiness as well. Dark blue means you produce and you export or you participate in trade of cars, of machinery, of more advanced products. And then you have the countries that participate in innovative activities, in services, in activities that are very research intensive. So if you look at this map as a whole, you can see that the entire world has some degree of participation, but countries participate in different ways by engaging in different activities, and that actually matters for the outcomes. I'm sure at this point you're wondering where Kenya is. So Kenya is in light blue here, and it participates in global value chains through limited manufacturing, mostly through agribusiness. So I'll come back to that because it turns out this is really important, but for Kenya, it's agribusiness that drives the participation. So what are the good effects that I talked about? So first, it turns out that firms that engage in this global value chain trade are more productive. They're more productive for the reason I explained before, that because you have these relationships, you have much more extensive knowledge transfer, technology transfer that benefits recipient countries. And one way you see it, so you can see data from Ethiopia. I didn't have the data from Kenya, but there are data from Ethiopia. So firms that both export and import tend to have higher productivity than firms that just export or just import. So again, to drive home the point, it's not just trade that's good. What's good here is that you both import and export. And perhaps one takeaway from all this is these days, many countries and many policymakers, including the United States, are fixated on a mercantilist point of view that exports are good, imports are bad. One important message of this work is that imports also have beneficial effects because imports facilitate, in many cases, technology transfer. So especially for developing countries, imports may play a very important role in productivity growth. Now, one natural response to this is, yes, you have these firms, they're more productive, they're also more capital intensive, they use more capital, they use more machines. But what this means is these firms may generate fewer jobs. And one issue that we care about a lot in developing countries is whether or not firms generate jobs, and by jobs I mean good jobs in the formal economy, jobs with benefits that give people security. The answer is these firms that are more productive and more capital intensive are also associated with employment growth. So again, you can see it here. Firms that both import and export tend to generate more jobs. How can that be? There is a scale effect. So firms that use more capital and more productive are firms that do well, they grow, and this size effect means they can hire more people. So yes, they might have hired even more people if they didn't use machines, but then they might have not been as productive. So we find very strong effects on employment and also growth. What this means is, in the end, that all this translates to poverty reduction. And the most dramatic case is the case of Vietnam. So I'll show you this picture. Vietnam is an incredible success story. It participated through limited manufacturing, so textiles mainly, but also agriculture to a certain extent. And what you see in this map, you can use regional variation in Vietnam to identify these effects. So these areas here in dark blue are the areas in which you have more firms participating in trade, in global value chain trade. And in green, you see the areas that experience the largest poverty reduction in Vietnam. And you can see that it's precisely those areas where you had more GVC trade, where you had more international trade activity. These are exactly the areas that also experience the fastest poverty reduction. The country as a whole experienced very rapid poverty reduction for many reasons, not just trade. There were also other policies that contributed. But the point of this graph is to show you that the trade played also a very important part, and especially trade within global value chains. Now, this is my favorite graph in the whole report. This is the graph that makes it very clear that global value chains have big effects on per capita income growth. So what this shows is what the cumulative effects of joining a global value chain are 20 years after a country joins, depending on whether this country joins through limited manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, or innovative activities. So let me spend some time on this graph to explain exactly what is going on. So first, one thing you may have noticed is that agriculture is not here, or raw commodities. So countries that participate just by exporting commodities or raw materials, we don't have any evidence that they grow very fast. And this is unfortunately very much consistent with the experience many developing countries have had, especially resource-rich countries in Africa. They may export, they may have high exports, but these exports don't translate to growth. They certainly don't translate to per capita income growth. So agriculture is not here, raw commodities are not here, oil exports are not here. Countries that participate through limited manufacturing, again, these are textiles for the most part, footwear, and so on. These are the countries that grow the fastest. So from the time they join to 25 years later, they have grown by 57%. So per capita, this is all per capita. So per capita income growth is cumulatively 57%. So essentially, this is the story of East Asia here. So this is the story of Vietnam and Korea, and before that, Japan in the early days, and China. Then countries that are here in the blue, so these are the countries that participate through, let's say, automobiles or machines and so on. So these countries also grow, so you still see growth, but it's lower. The cumulative growth is 48%, that participate through innovative activities. So these are research-intensive activities. So most advanced countries are here, and still you see growth, about 32%, but it's lower. This is exactly what you would expect, because countries that are here tend to be richer to start with. And if you're richer, you naturally, it becomes harder to grow. Countries who are here in the light green, these are the countries that have the most to gain. These countries grow very fast. Another thing to keep in mind in this graph is that many countries are in all three parts of the graph because they transition from one part to another. So, for example, Korea is a very interesting case, or Japan. So Korea started through limited manufacturing, by exporting textiles, footwear, and then it moved to advanced manufacturing, cars, and now it's here, innovative activities. Many countries in Europe also fit this pattern. They start here, then they move to the blue, and then they move to the purple. Okay? So, as I said, this is a graph that sends a very strong message, namely that global value chains do participate, do generate this very rapid, this incredibly rapid growth. Now, one question that people often ask us, and I think this is particularly relevant for developing countries, and especially for countries like Kenya, is, I said before that you have countries that transition from one part to another. And countries in general want that because that means higher incomes for them. So when you are here, that these are countries that have very low wages. Eventually, these countries want to raise the standard of living. They want workers to get better wages, better living conditions. So most countries want this transition. One question that people often ask us is, do we see leapfrogging? So can countries skip one stage? So can you start, for example, with limited manufacturing and then move all the way to services and innovation and research? Or can you start with agriculture and never go through limited manufacturing or advanced manufacturing and go straight to services? And often this is a dream that's sold to developing countries these days. I will just say that we don't have a single case of a single country in our data that has managed to achieve that. The difference across countries is that some countries spend very little time in one stage or another. So, for example, Korea is a success case. Korea spent very little time on limited manufacturing and then transitioned very fast to high value added activities, so activities that generate very higher per capita income, but we don't see any leapfrogging in our data. And of course, this is all backward looking, so this is based on historical experience. It doesn't mean it's impossible in the future, but again, it makes it less likely when we have never witnessed it in the past. One natural question is, so how does Kenya fare in this picture? And I'm afraid that I don't have a very optimistic message here. So Kenya has increased in its participation in global value chain. So if you look at this is the purple line here in my graph, you can see that over the last 20 years, it has been steadily increasing its participation in global value chains, but it's still lower compared to what the global average is. And also it's, I'll skip this one, it's the same, by the way, applies to Ethiopia. Now, Kenya participates, as I said earlier, through limited manufacturing. So I told you before that limited manufacturing in our previous picture is associated with this very high growth in per capita incomes. If you look at what happened in Kenya, and also I put here Ethiopia in this graph as well, because it's a nice contrast, it's a nice comparison. And Ethiopia is also mentioned often as a success case, a country that's growing very fast. But in both cases, if you see what's happening, is the growth in both countries is substantially lower than the growth that developing countries have experienced in the past. So in other words, we don't see in Kenya or Ethiopia what we saw in East Asia. So this is another way to show the graph I showed you before. After 25 years, you have cumulative growth of 57%, but you see growth after 5 years, after 10 years, after 15 years, after 20 years. So this is the global average, and this is the average here for Ethiopia. This is what's happening here with Kenya. So after 10 years of participation in limited manufacturing, you have only 4% per capita income growth in Kenya. Here, this is 4% that you can attribute to global value chains alone. So it's substantially lower. So what is going on here, and how is this compatible with what I told you before? What drives this is mainly the fact that in Kenya, you don't have much manufacturing. The participation through pure manufacturing, textiles and so on, is very low. It's all agribusiness. And so agribusiness does not generate these big growth effects that we see in manufacturing. But the reason for that is there is a literature that's mostly based on data from Latin America and Europe, looking at the supermarket revolution in these countries. And what this literature has shown is that in many cases, agribusiness is the result of development. It's not the driver of development. What I mean by that is in many countries, incomes start to grow. There is a middle class. The middle class wants more food. They want more diversity. They want more food diversity. They want better quality, more variety. And that generates demand for food, for agricultural products. Then, as a result, you get an intermediary sector, so a sector that is between farmers and between consumers. And this sector consists of distributors and marketers and so on. So this is the agribusiness, right? And agribusiness can generate high incomes, but you need the middle class first in order to generate these incomes. So this is one of the reasons I think that we don't see this fast development in Kenya or Ethiopia that we see in other countries. So I will skip that. So this doesn't mean necessarily that it's too late, for Africa to reap the gains from global value chains and trade. But again, our research so far suggests that perhaps manufacturing and industrializations are still important stages. So we don't have any evidence that without those, countries can advance very fast. Or to qualify what I just said, maybe it is possible, but not at the pace that East Asia achieved such growth. Maybe countries need to take it slower if they want to grow through agribusiness or services. And another question was, I started by saying, so to summarize so far, the answer is globally, based on other countries, we see that global value chains have had these very fast effects on per capita income growth. We haven't seen these effects in Africa yet, certainly not in Kenya or Ethiopia, and this is partly because they don't participate through manufacturing. But then so perhaps this is one way they can engage more fully in global trade in the future. But then there are two challenges that they face. One of the challenges is automation, and the other challenge is the rise of protectionism. And briefly, we don't find any evidence that automation is eliminating jobs. This was one of the big surprises in our work. I'll show you, this graph here. Industries that employ more robots, so cars, the automobile industry, this is the classic example. It turns out that industries that use a lot of robots are also industries that have increased their trade with developing countries. And the reason for that is as these countries expand, again, there is a scale effect. Firms that use more robots are firms that do well, they become more productive, they expand, and as they expand, they need more parts, they need more components, they need more intermediate products. They still import these intermediate products from developing countries. So what we actually found is that automation and robots are good news for developing countries. They may be bad news for advanced countries. They may be replacing workers and people in advanced countries, and there is a huge debate about these issues in advanced countries, but they still generate trade with developing countries because they still need to import parts and components from developing countries. So far, we don't find any evidence that automation is eliminating trade with developing countries. What is perhaps a bigger challenge, a much bigger challenge for developing countries, is the rise of protectionism in advanced countries. And there, I have to say, the ball is in the court of advanced countries. I want to say a few words. I don't have much time, but I want to say a few words about the costs of GVC participation. So far, I've told you good things about global value chains, all the good things that global value chains do. There is also another side that we have to be aware of. In many developing countries, policymakers and the public as well prioritize growth, per capita income growth. This is natural. The first priority, the main priority is to lift people out of poverty. But at the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that ultimately the goal is not to raise income, is to achieve better living standards. And with that in mind, we ask the question, so what are the effects of global value chains on various measures of inequality? One pretty striking finding is that global value chains lead to a rise in profits of firms, as we call them, lead firms in advanced countries. they actually lead to a decline in profit margins in developing countries. So this graph, it will show you, it tells the full picture. This graph compares markups, so profits in the textile industry in two countries, Japan, which is an advanced country, and India, which is a developing country. Both countries have very high participation in the textile industry, but in different ways. So what you see is the blue line shows what happens to profit margins, markups as we call them. In Japan, the profit margins rise over time. In India, the profit margins decline over time. This is not specific to these countries. We find this for literally all countries in our sample. And intuitively, what's going on here is if you think about how Japan participates, Japan imports cheap cloth or cheap cotton from developing countries, it processes it, and then it produces more advanced products and then exports those. Because of global value chains, because of globalization, countries like Japan can source these inputs from the cheapest country, from the cheapest developing country. So the cost becomes very low because of globalization. They don't necessarily pass this cost through to consumers, so as a result, their profit margins increase. So that's the story for these countries. On the other hand, the countries that sell the inputs, they cannot take advantage of this mechanism. So actually, these countries sell their inputs in many cases at lower prices. Here, the story is one of monopsony. So we don't see countries, firms in developing countries raising their profits. This is a big issue these days that's debated very extensively in advanced countries. Let me skip that. What about the effects on women? The effects on women are also mixed in many countries. Global value chains and more generally trade and manufacturing have led to more jobs for women, more jobs in the formal sector. This is the good news. On the other hand, they have not allowed women to break the glass ceiling. So there is a lot of evidence from many developing countries. Vietnam is a very interesting case because Vietnam has the highest female labor force participation. So this is a case where, because of trade, because of global value chains, it was possible to integrate women in the labor force. But then you find that most women are employed as production workers, not administrative workers. Production workers tend to have lower wages. And also we don't see many women to own businesses or hold managerial positions. Taxes are a very important issue. And again, developing countries are on the losing end. Why are taxes an important issue? Because one of the implications of global value chains is because big firms are active globally, it becomes easier for them to shift profits across locations. That means countries lose tax revenue. And all countries lose in terms of absolute amounts. It's actually the more advanced countries, it's the OECD countries that lose the most simply because there is more economic activity there. But if you ask the question, how much do countries lose as percentage of GDP, then it's the non-OECD countries that lose the most. Okay, so this is an important issue that we flag in the report. It's not one issue that it's easy to remedy, but it's an issue that really takes international multilateral cooperation to fully address. And finally, there are also mixed effects on the environment. And what I mean by that is, if you think what global value chains do is you break up the product and then you start trading parts back and forth. So that means more transport, more carbon emissions, more packaging, more waste. On the positive side, I have to say we didn't find any evidence of pollution havens. So there has always been this allegation that firms in developed countries export pollution. They take pollution-intensive activities and they ship them off to developing countries. Actually, we do not find any evidence of firms actually doing this. However, we do find evidence of additional costs on the environment because of waste and transport. There are also some good effects in the sense that many firms in advanced countries these days push for higher environmental standards and also for higher labor standards in developing countries. And from the point of view of developing countries, this is a mixed blessing because sometimes it's impossible to miss these standards. And sometimes this advanced country perspective means it becomes much more expensive for a developing country, for a country like Kenya, to meet the standards and successfully participate. On the other hand, it may in the long run, it may have beneficial effects on everyone, because better environment, a cleaner environment, is associated with a higher quality of life.